We're ranking all of the bleed weapons today, all 44 of them, which is definitely a healthy amount, and you guys better be appreciative of the effort and knowledge I'm about to drop. But basically, every single weapon that does get a passive bleed effect is going to appear on this list, and we're going to rank them from worst to best and put them in a tier as well. Now, just like all my ranking videos, yes, I have done an entire playthrough with every single one of these weapons, so I do have lots of opinions and knowledge on them. Now, as for the criteria, it is just going to be based on how useful the weapon is itself, so it's not necessarily based on how good it is or how good the bleed build-up can actually be. So there might be some really good weapons that just don't get higher on the list because there's something else that just directly outclasses it, making it not as useful. And if there is a particular weapon of which you do like and you want to see me make a build around, more chances than not, I've already made that build. So just let me know down in the comments, I can just redirect you to that video. But as for the gameplay, I pretty much just use like the same generic basic build. It's not min-max at all. So like the weapons aren't going to be hitting as hard as they potentially could, but that's perfectly fine because what I am saying is what is actually going to have merit and what you should be focusing on anyway. But yes, let us get started. Starting off right at the bottom where it belongs, the Varese Bouquet. This weapon is complete doo-doo trash. It has terrible range. It's a hammer, so it gets a bad moveset. Its weapon skill is Blood Tax, which is not unique. I don't know why this thing got a poking attack moveset when it's a hammer. Don't know why I didn't get anything unique at all. It's literally a bouquet. Think of something more creative, please. But the worst thing about it is its damage. At plus 10, fully maxed out, its base damage is 112. Just for comparison, a regular dagger maxed out is 181. So even a dagger outdamages it. Also, for another comparison, if you were to take a broadsword, just a regular straight sword at plus 0, not even upgraded, it literally gets higher base damage than the Varese Bouquet fully maxed out. Now, some of the redeeming factors that I guess it does have is, one, an arcane scaling, and it can be buffed. So you actually compare it alongside some bleed greases and get some very nice blood loss build up. But the thing is, in this game, every single time that you proc a status effect, it's going to be harder to proc it the next time. So if your only damage is blood loss build up, then you're not going to really get very far. And also, if you're going up against an enemy that's resist to bleed, you might as well just not use it at all. It's terrible. But another positive thing I can say is that the weapon is very light. And that is basically it. This weapon just sucks and it wishes it was as good as Raid Shadow Legends, one of the most immersive and ambitious games of the modern gaming era, period. Now, if you don't know what Raid Shadow Legends is, we're talking about a free-to-play fantasy RPG with a captivating storyline, amazing online PvP, with one of the most visually pleasing fantasy worlds featuring over 800 champions across 15 playable factions. Now, this game is actually available on Android, iOS, and on PC, and you can actually play it today, right now, if you actually click the link in the description and download the game or use the QR code on screen right now. Now, you might be thinking, Yui, what's with the urgency? Why do you want us to download the game straight away? And that's because if you click the link right now and download the game, you get added benefits for free. All you gotta do is just click the link in the description and download the game, and you will actually obtain Lightsworn, which is a very strong epic champion. And in addition, once you achieve level 15, you can also receive Juliana, which is another epic champion and a boss killer. Now, this type of terminology might seem very familiar to you Elden Ring players. If you guys love holy damage and holy builds as much as I do, then you're gonna love these two champions right here and just love Raid Shadow Legends in general. And for a limited time, if you type in the code Monkey King, you can acquire the super strong legendary champion Sun Wukong for absolutely nothing. It is literally free. Just having one of the best champions unlocked right at the beginning is such an amazing head start, and will just make your entire campaign experience just so fun. So if all this seems interesting to you, which it actually should, definitely click the link in the description once again, or use the QR code, and you can download and play Raid Shadow Legends today. Number 43, the Inquisitor's Garandal. Now, this is a spear of which does get the regular poking attack moveset. It does get split fire damage and a faith-based scaling, which is actually pretty cool, but unfortunately, it doesn't get a unique weapon skill. It gets stuck with Charge Forth. If it has had a unique skill, it ended up being like an A2 weapon, but it doesn't really get that. And that 50 blood loss split up that it does get is definitely not enough. It will take a while to actually end up proccing bleed, and you can't improve it at all because you can't buff it, infuse it, nor does it have an arcane scaling. Number 42, we have the regular Flail. Now, Flail weapon classes themselves tend to be pretty shitty because their range is not that good, their movesets are slow, the total damage you can get with them isn't that great either, and they don't really have many Ash of War options. And even the weapon requirements tend to be pretty high for just no reason. But the only good thing about the Flail is that they tend to get some decent poise damage, which the best way to poise break is by using the charged heavy attacks, which the Flail charged heavy attack is probably the worst in the entire game. It's just so incredibly slow. The regular hammer does the exact same poise damage in about half the time, so you're just always better off just using a hammer every single time. But if Flails had a faster heavy attack and spinning chain as an equipable Ash of War, that would end up being a lot better as a weapon class. Now moving along into the C tier, we have the Wakizashi. Now this weapon is a dagger of which can actually be power stance with other katanas, which is actually pretty unique. However, it's still not much of a benefit because the Power Stance Katana moveset isn't really that great, and you're still better off just using another katana because you're just going to get more damage, because obviously daggers just don't get as much. But the only benefit in doing that is to have parry on, and parrying in this game isn't really that great. But using a dagger by itself can actually still be pretty decent because it does actually have the highest base damage compared to all of the other daggers. But I still wouldn't use it as a primary option because one, daggers aren't really that viable to begin with, and this one in particular doesn't even get 110 crit multiplier, which is definitely like the best thing about having a dagger. It only gets 100, so I don't really see much of a purpose to this weapon. Number 40, we have the Forked Hatchet. Now this is an axe, which axes tend to be a pretty poor weapon class due to the fact that they have a very poor movesets, not the best range, not the best damage, nor do they have many good Ash of War options. But the Forked Hatchet in particular does actually get the faster light attack combo, shares the exact same one as the Hand Axe and the Ice Wind Hatchet, which coupled with the Bloodlust build up, it actually might make for a nice pairing. However, the range is just outright terrible and the damage is not that good at all. You're better off just using like a Bleed Dagger, you probably end up doing more DPS. But obviously axes do stagger and do a bit more poise damage than a regular dagger does do, so it still has a specific use. Number 39, the Chain Link Flail. Now, as I was talking about with the regular flail, these are just not that good. Their movesets suck. They don't really do the best damage. And with the Chain Link Flail in particular, this one is just going to be your strength-based option, which I guess can be pretty decent, being that this dexterity requirement is actually a lot lower compared to some of the other flails. Now, it does look like it has a lot more range, but it doesn't really compared to all the other flails. It's basically the exact same. It's just a model that's longer for some reason, but the hitboxes are just not. But as I was saying before, if flails had spinning chain as an equipable Ash of War, that would just end up being a lot better. Might as well continue talking about flails and get into the Knight Rider's flail. Now, this one is just going to be your dexterity-based version of a flail, and it just gets a lot higher for requirements, obviously, but it does get some more damage. And I tend to prefer just having a dexterity-based flail because it's unique in the fact that there's not many striking-based dexterity weapons, but the flails actually do that. But still, they don't really get the best movesets, they don't get the best Ash of War options, so it just can't get much higher than a C tier. Number 37, the Bloodstained Dagger. Now this is going to be your strength-based bleeding dagger, which daggers in general I don't really care to like as a primary-based option. I only tend to use them as a secondary-based option, whether to be to use Golden Vow or just to like proc a status effect or whatnot. Where in this instance, I guess you would use a Bloodstained Dagger if you had a strength-based build and you wanted to like proc bleed quickly. If you wanted to, you could have that as a secondary backup. I guess that's its only use. It does get some decent base damage, but I'm still going to prefer the Great Knife over it due to that one having better scalings, and dexterity will just end up pairing a lot better with other types of daggers if you did want a power stance. Number 36, the Spiked Club. Now this is going to be the reason why flails gets lower on the list, because this weapon is a hammer, which hammers just tend to be the upgraded version of a flail due to the fact that they have very similar movesets, but just a much faster heavy attack with the exact same poise damage values. Now this one in particular does get a slightly unique heavy attack. It's basically the exact same thing, just slight different animation. But the reason why this is going to get lower on the list is because the Morningstar exists, and that's just another hammer, of which just performs better due to the fact that it has higher base damage and a much better moveset. Now this weapon actually does get better scalings than the Morningstar, so maybe at higher levels you notice that it might just out damage it, but I still would rather have the Morningstar due to its better moveset. Number 35, the Forked Greatsword. Now this is a greatsword of which actually just gets the regular greatsword moveset, which is actually not too bad. The heavy attacks actually do come out pretty fast, but the reason why it's going to get lower on the list is because the Flamberge exists, and that one is just the exact same thing, just gets more damage and more range. Now the heavy attacks are slightly different. The Flamberge just gets a bunch of horizontal swipes, whereas the Forked Greatsword does get the overhead slam, which I tend to prefer a little bit more, but it's not that big of a difference to want me to prefer it over the boosted range and the damage that the Flamberge actually gets. Number 34, the Winged Scythe. Now this is going to be more of a PvP based weapon due to the fact that its weapon skill, Angel Wings, does actually stop enemies from healing. But being that this is a PvE based list, it's still not going to get that high because the skill is just basically the exact same animation as Loretta's Slash. But I just prefer to have Loretta's Slash because one, you can infuse it onto any type of weapon, prepared alongside a status effect like Frost, and have Bleed alongside with that, and you're not doing holy damage, which holy damage is not that great in this game. And there is another Holy Faith type of scythe that just performs a lot better in the Halo scythe, as we'll get into. Number 33, the Vulgar Militia Saw. Now this is a halberd, which is pretty cool because no other halberd does actually have passive bleed. But unfortunately, you're better off just using like the Grave Scythe, which is a Reaper, obviously, but it does get very similar Ash of War options, and that would just end up having more range and just more damage, because the Vulgar Militia Sword doesn't get the best range at all, and it gets the regular halberd moveset, which I'm not too big of a fan of. But the fact that it is a halberd that does get bleed, it can't really be that bad, hence it's still being a B tier. Number 32, we have the Hook Claws. Now, these are just like the basic generic claws that you do get in the game. And claws are actually a pretty underrated weapon class. They actually can output some very nice damage. And being that you do have status effects with all of them, you actually can proc bleed or poison, depending on which one you're using, very quickly. Now, the reason I'm going to prefer the Hook Claws the least over the other ones is because that the other ones are going to output more damage. Even though this one actually does have higher base damage than the Raptor Talons does actually have the better heavy attack and actually does get bonus damage on jumping attacks, which this one doesn't really get. And when you're using claws, jumping attacks is probably going to be your best option. Number 31, the Meteoric All Blade. Now this is a katana of which actually does get split magic damage and a strength and intelligence based scaling. Now that means unfortunately you can't actually buff or infuse it, nor actually have an arcane scaling, so therefore you can't really improve the blood loss build up at all, and 50 blood loss build up is really not that much. But the reason why it's going to get lower on the list is because one, it doesn't get a unique weapon skill, it gets Gravitas, which already is not even that good. But even if it was good, it's not unique, you're just still better off using the Uchi katana and it's infusing it with literally anything. And its heavy attack, although it is unique, I still don't really care for it much. It doesn't get like higher poise damage than all of the other heavy attacks, and I still just rather have the poking heavy attacks that the other katanas get, because like piercing damage is actually just really good and this katana doesn't really have that, so not too big of a fan, but it does look cool. Number 30, we have the Thorned Whip. Now whips are probably like the worst weapon class in the entire game because you just don't get a good moveset, you get a pretty slow moveset, the damage isn't really that great. You get the least amount of Ash of War options, you can't do critical attacks, and you literally get less poise damage than a dagger, which is just pathetic. But positive things I can say about the whips is that they have really good range and they can stagger okay against some smaller types of enemies. But it's still not enough for them to be decent weapons. They definitely need the ability to do critical attacks, and they actually need some more Ash of War options and some more poise damage, please. The only good thing about whips is one, the Urumi, and two, power sensing bleed whips, and that is literally it. And when you're power sensing bleed whips, you just spam the jumping attacks, and if you go up against an enemy that cannot be procced bleed against, then you kind of just suck because it's not going to do good damage at all. But being that we're talking about whips, we might as well just go head into the Hoslo's Petal Whip, which is just like very similar. It's just going to be the slightly better version because it gets more damage and has more blood loss build up, but you're going to get one per playthrough, so you can just might as well just power sense it alongside the Thorned Whip and just spam your jumping attacks and whatever type of build you want to make alongside with this. It actually can perform pretty well, but in terms of power sensing bleed type builds, I would still rather just go with like curved swords or the spears. They'll just end up performing a lot better, but you can still have some decent amount of fun with the whips. Number 28, the Sword of Milos. Now this is a great sword of which actually does only get a strength and dexterity based scaling, so therefore being that you can't infuse nor buff it, you're not going to be able to improve that blood loss build up, which being only stuck at 55 is not really the greatest thing in the world. Now the best thing about this weapon is going to be its skill Shriek of Milos, which for 30 FP does debuff enemies to make them take more damage, and there is actually another passive effect of when you get kills when this weapon is equipped, you just get some more FP back. Now the cool thing is you don't even need to actually kill the weapon itself. As long as you have it equipped, it's perfectly fine. So a good pairing alongside with this will be the Blasphemous Blade. People tend to like to pair them together. I don't recommend power sensing them at all. I recommend this two-handed Blasphemous Blade and it's having it equipped, because the Sword of Milos doesn't get a faith-based scaling, and with the Blasphemous Blade your best is going like mostly into faith. So your power sensing damage is not going to be good, just two-handed Blasphemous Blade. But another annoying thing about the Sword of Milos is that the heavy attack is actually unique, but when you use the weapon skill Shriek of Milos, it actually changes up the heavy attack to just be a worse one because you just get a longer animation and you're not going to poise break as quick. So having this as a primary option, in my opinion, is just not good. But using it as a way to just debuff enemies and just gain some passive FP regen is probably going to be its only use in my opinion. Number 27, we have the Great Knife. Now this is going to be a dagger, which I've said before, daggers are just not going to be the best primary based options due to the fact that they don't stagger very well, damage isn't really that great, and their range is pretty poor. You're always just better off going with like a straight sword or a curved sword because they have more range, they can honestly just do more DPS, and they can actually stagger. But the Great Knife in particular is actually still pretty decent because its scalings are actually really good. You can get like an A scaling in dexterity, and you can actually get an A scaling in arcane with an occult infusion, which is actually really good because you can pair it alongside some blade type Ash of Wars and just do a bunch of damage that way. Especially Blood Blade, which is just going to be a very similar version of the Reduvia, but you can actually just get more damage with the Great Knife compared to the Reduvia, so you actually can look at it as the better option. But if you're just going to want to use something as a primary option and have Blood Blade, you're better off just going with the Scavenger's Curve Sword or the Nagakiba, because you can just put it on those weapons and they're just going to be better because more movesets, more range, more damage, more stagger potential. Now getting into the A tier, we have the Raptor Talons, which is a claw that does get a dexterity based scaling, which is very similar to the hook claws. That one actually does get higher base damage, but the reason why I'm going to prefer this one is because one, it does get the better heavy attack. It actually has a cool lunging attack that hits at the exact same time, which means it's going to have a quicker animation, meaning you're going to have like more of a chance to be able to dodge afterwards. And this thing just has higher motion values on your jumping attacks. Just compared to the hook claws, it just does like 10% more jumping attack damage. To which pairing this weapon alongside a jumping attack build using like the claw talisman and the Raptor Feathers chest piece, you can just output a lot more damage with this compared to the hook claws. So that's the reason why I prefer the Raptor Talons a bit more. Number 25, we have the regular Scythe. Now, Scythes in general just tend to have pretty decent movesets, decent range, okay poise damage. They don't really do anything too amazing, but they do just do everything pretty good. And for the regular Scythe, I just think that this one is just not going to be good as the Grave Scythe because that one just gets like a lot more damage. But this one is going to be your dexterity based one, whereas that one is going to be your strength based one. And the regular Scythe actually does get a different heavy attack. Actually gets a cool double swiping attack when fully charged, which actually can pair nicely alongside some status effect builds because obviously it is hitting multiple times, which is really nice. So if you're going to really go into a status effect type of build, sometimes you actually might benefit more of the regular Scythe than you would with the Grave Scythe, but in most cases I still end up going more towards the Grave Scythe because one, it looks cooler and it just does more damage. Number 24, we have the Morningstar. Now, as I mentioned earlier with this Spiked Club, this one is just going to be another hammer that just gets the better moveset because its running heavy attacks is a poking attack. Also, the crouch and the rolling attack is another poke. And just having pokes, it's always going to be really cool and it's nice variety to its moveset itself. And the Morningstar does actually have some higher base damage. So if you want a smaller weapon that can do some nice poise damage, this one is probably going to be your best bet. It's going to be better than all the other flails and probably better than all the other hammers as well. Number 23, the Hand of Millennia. Now, this is a katana of which actually just gets a dexterity-based scaling, cannot infuse nor buff it, so therefore you cannot improve that 50 blood loss build-up that it actually does get, which you won't really benefit off much, and you won't really notice that it's going to proc bleed as much, but obviously the fact that it is there is really nice. But the best things about this weapon is that one, it's a katana, so its moveset's going to be really nice, and it has amazing range, and its weapon skill is actually pretty cheap for how much damage that it does do. Now, however, Waterfowl Dance, you get stuck in a longer animation, you don't really get much hyper armor, it consumes a lot of stamina, and against enemies that cannot get staggered, you're basically just going to be a sitting duck, and you're just not going to win most of those trades. But against skinnier enemies, it can perform extremely well. So in my opinion, this weapon just deserves a buff. I just would like it to just not consume as much stamina. Maybe after you use its weapon skill to make it just more fluid to go from one part to the next, because if you just delay it by a little bit, it just won't work and it'll queue up the input again. And then maybe, just maybe, if you want to give it some Scarlet Rot and some like health regen benefits, that'd be really cool. Number 22, we have the Flamberge, which is just like the good old reliable in almost like every single Souls game. It's a great sword, you get some decent movesets, you get some good damage, you get some nice range, and you get blood loss build up. Like, there's not much to really talk about. It's like just a good, solid overall weapon, and it looks really fucking cool. Number 21, we have the Spiked Castus. Now, this is a fist-based weapon, of which actually does get that Castus moveset, which is those cool Kung Fu punching attacks, where those charged heavies actually do some very nice poise damage and some good total overall damage. Now, this thing can actually perform just as well as like almost any other S tier weapon in terms of its DPS and poise damage, but unfortunately, the Star Fist is just going to be the better option due to the fact that it has like a much faster heavy, as we'll get into. But if you did want to pair this alongside some like multi-hit talismans like the Millicent Prosthesis, you actually could probably end up getting some higher DPS. But for me, at least, I would just much rather have just the faster animation that the Star Fist and Iron Balls do get. But fist weapons are just like really good. It cannot be understated how much damage they can actually output. Number 20, we have the Great Omen Killer Cleaver. Now, this weapon, I do want to put it a lot higher because I like Great Axes that have a really nice moveset, do some decent damage, they stagger pretty well, their poise damage is not too bad either. And just having that weapon with bleed is just going to be really cool. But unfortunately, the Great Stars is a weapon that exists, which is like the exact same thing, just a lot better. That's a great hammer, so it just has more poise damage, it gets strike damage, which is better than standard damage, and you get health on every single hit, so it's just going to be the better option like every single time. But the Great Omen Killer Cleaver is still an amazing weapon. Number 19, the Reduvia. Okay, let's talk about it again. Yes, you can beat the game incredibly easily with the Reduvia. Everything can die straight away. You don't need any skill to beat the game with this weapon right here. But as I said at the beginning of the video, the list is going to be based on how useful something is. And being that the Bloodblade Ash of War is just a lot better than the Reduvia Bloodblade Ash of War, it's just not going to be as useful. Now let's talk about why Bloodblade is actually better. I do have a whole dedicated video if you want to see the whole like damage number comparisons. But just to go over it really quickly, the regular Bloodblade consumes half the amount of FP, a lot less stamina, does a lot more damage, and you can do some more blood loss build up depending on what type of weapon and scaling that you actually pair it alongside with. If you have something like the Great Knife, which is like another dagger, make it a Cult Infuse, it gets an A scaling and arcane, it just does way more damage than the Reduvia can get. And better yet, you can actually pair it alongside an actual good weapon class like a Curved Sword or a Katana in the Scavenger's Curved Sword or the Nagakiba. Put Bloodblade on that, and not only do you have the better weapon class, you also get the better Ash of War. And if you hit at point blank range, which is an actual hitbox, it's going to be a lot easier to do that with a larger weapon, and you're going to be doing so much more damage with that than you could ever do with the Reduvia. Now, yes, I know it does consume some health. However, it only consumes 50 HP on its initial cast. Every single successive cast doesn't consume any health at all. And even if you take into account the Ritual Sword Talisman buff, Bloodblade still just gets more damage. Now, the reason why Reduvia still gets at least this high is for a couple reasons. One, the fact that it does consume health with regular Bloodblade means that Reduvia is going to be a better option earlier on, because 50 HP, although it's not much like toward the second half of the game. The first half of the game, it might be a big deal. And Reduvia Asher War actually does scale off AR, whereas regular Bloodblade only scales off Arcane. So maybe at extremely high levels, Reduvia might end up out-damaging Bloodblade. But at extremely high levels, I wouldn't really want to be using a dagger anyway. So yes, Reduvia does have its specific uses, but Bloodblade is better. Glad we put that to rest. Let's move along. Number 18, the Spiked Spear. Now this weapon, no, it's not going to be as good as the Cross Naginata due to the fact that it has a lot less range and doesn't really have the cool moveset. But it actually still is going to be slightly unique due to the fact that its heavy attacks is a nice horizontal swipe, which most spears don't really get that at all, so it's going to be some nice variety there. And it actually does get some striking damage, which no other spear actually does get striking damage, which is pretty cool. Actually, not many dexterity weapons in general get striking damage, so this one is probably going to be one of the better ones that can do that. And being they can only get one Cross Naginata per playthrough, this one's just going to be an obvious option to power stance. I literally just made a build around this just a couple days ago. You can go check that one out. Number 17, the Bloodhound Claws. Now this is going to be the last of the claw weapons we're going to talk about, and this one just ends up getting the most damage and actually does get that strength scaling as well, and actually does have that added benefit of hitting around shields very similar to what a scythe can do. Now as I was saying, claws can actually output some very nice DPS. They can actually do some bloodlust build up very quickly as well, depending on what type of build you pair it alongside with. But in my opinion, if you're going with a shorter range option, I would just much rather just use fist-based weapons like the Star Fist. It does perform a lot better, way more damage. But claw weapons still have very good movesets. They can still like do some very nice bloodlust build up, so they still have their own specific uses. But for a shorter range weapon, I'd much rather use a Star Fist. Number 16, the Eleonora's Pole Blade. Now this weapon I actually considered it an S tier once upon a time until I did an entire playthrough with a challenge run only using the weapon skill, and that made me realize that the weapon skill is just not as good as I thought, because the damage output that it gets is not that great. There are so many other weapon skills out there that is like melt a lot faster than this thing does. The cool charge heavy attacks that the Eleonora's Pole Blade gets just can do more damage than like the whole weapon skill. But the best thing about the weapon skill itself is that one, it does some very good poise damage. 45 stance damage is actually extremely good, and it actually can stun lock enemies really well, especially like the smaller based ones. So against smaller enemies, it can be like one of the best weapon skills in the entire game. But against like larger enemies that cannot get staggered very easily, it's just like not good because you get stuck in a longer animation, and being that you don't really do as much damage, you're just not going to be able to like win that trade much. So if you end up going against like a larger enemy, I just wouldn't bother using the weapon skill at all. I'll just like keep spamming the regular light attack combo, which for twin blades, I don't really care much for like the regular light attack combo. I think that just katanas, straight swords, and curved swords just have the better combo. But being that you can get some decent total overall damage with this thing, the bloodlust builder can be very nice, then poise damage can be pretty cool as well. And being that it can just like completely fuck up smaller types of enemies, it still can get a higher A tier. Number 15, we have the Rivers of Blood. Yes, if you haven't played the game in like 3 years, it has been nerfed. That like projectile blood part of the weapon skill just no longer does as much damage, doesn't do as much bloodlust build up, doesn't stagger as well. So you only really benefit off it by hitting at like a point blank range with the weapon model itself, which at that point, you're better off just using like a Nagakiba or the Uchigatana with double slash, because you could just end up just doing more damage, more bloodlust build up for like a third of the amount of FP. I do have a whole like dedicated video breaking it down exactly if you want to know the damage numbers, but the reason why the weapon's still going to get at least this high is because that extended part does like double the range of the weapon. So you actually can be like at a certain distance and actually just like pick enemies off, do some nice bloodlust build up, some nice damage at a safer distance. It's not going to be as much as it used to be, but it still can be an easy weapon to use. And yes, it can still fuck up Millennia pretty easily. So it's not an overpowered weapon anymore, but it doesn't suck either. Number 14, we have the Geezer's Will. Now this weapon would easily be an S tier if it just wasn't bugged. Now if you don't know what this is, it's a colossal weapon of which only gets a strength and dexterity scaling, so there's no way to actually improve that bloodlust build up, but it's perfectly fine because its weapon skill actually makes the weapon spin around a whole bunch to where it can hit enemies really quickly and actually proc that bloodlust build up really nicely. Now unfortunately, this actually won't work with the multi-hit talismans like Millicent Prosthesis, but it doesn't really need it because as you can see, it can just like melt enemies incredibly quickly, but it's only for the smaller enemies, because as you can see against larger bosses, for whatever reason, it just bugs out and just doesn't spin anywhere near as fast. And if you're not spinning fast, you're not doing good damage. And it's been like this for a while now. Don't know why they haven't fixed it. But the reason why this is still going to get pretty high is because that spinning effect is actually also added onto the heavy attack as well. And when you use the one-handed charged heavy attack, it actually just slams it into the one location and will spin a whole bunch. And the good thing about the heavy attack is that it does work with the multi-hit talismans like Millicent Prosthesis. And as you can see, when you pair it alongside a heavy attack build and these types of talismans, you can just output a whole bunch of damage. So using the heavy attack every single time can just be the better play. Now, unfortunately, this means that using a heavy attack is going to be more risky, because obviously you're stuck in a longer animation. So if they just did fix the stupid bug that goes around with the weapon skill, it would easily be an S tier weapon. Number 13, the Uchigatana. Now this is obviously a katana, which that is one of the best weapon classes in the entire game due to their just fast movesets, really good range, nice damage, obviously inherent bloodlust build up. And the ones that can be infused, you can pair it alongside Unsheath, which that skill is just one of the best in the entire game because it's really cheap, does a lot of damage and some nice poise damage as well. Now I would like to put it into the S tier, but I just think the Nagakiba is just way better because it has way more range and it just gets the better moveset with the heavy attacks in my opinion. But the Uchigatana can still get like a higher A tier because it does actually have more damage than the Nagakiba. But the damage isn't that much more, and I would just much rather have the ridiculous range that the Nagakiba gets. Number 12, we have the Grave Scythe. Now, this bad boy right here is one of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game, and it actually is really good because the damage is just incredible, and scythes themselves are just a very solid overall weapon class. They don't do anything too amazing, but they just do everything nice. Nice moveset, decent range, they have good Ash of War options. So in terms of the strength-based bleed weapons, this one's definitely up there. Reason why it's not going to get an S is because I don't think scythes really just have that much going for them compared to some of the other strength-based weapons. Like Great Hammers get very similar Ash of War options, but just get way more poise damage for very similar speeds and produce more base damage as well. But with a scythe, you actually get some style points as well, which is really cool. Now getting into the S tier, number 11, we have the Halo Scythe. Now I did just say that scythes don't really do much to actually warrant them being an S tier, but this one does because its weapon skill, Miquella's Ring of Light. For only 11 FP, you can just spam this like long range projectile that actually has a nice little AoE, can stagger pretty well, and do some very decent total overall damage. And just having projectiles in this game just makes everything just incredibly easy. You can just sit at the back of the map and just have a grand old time just clicking the same button over and over again. Now, unfortunately, yes, it does holy damage, so against like some of the later game bosses, it's just not going to perform that well at all. Against like the last boss, it's just basically useless because they're just 80% resist to holy and you can't bleed them out either. But throughout the rest of the game, it still performs extremely well. It's still a scythe, so it gets a nice moveset on top of that. Definitely going to be one of the better faith-based weapons in the entire game. Number 10, Morgott's Cursed Sword. Now this is going to be a curved greatsword, which they just get some amazing movesets, and this one in particular actually does get the most range and actually is the lightest curved greatsword on top of that, which is really good. And its weapon skill, Cursed Blood Slice, actually does do some nice damage, some good poise damage for not that long of an animation on top of that. But the one downside to this is that it does consume a lot of FP. It's like 20 FP for every single swing. And if you do the follow-up, that's like a 40 FP combo, which it definitely is worth it. But compared to some of the other weapon skills that you'll see on this list, probably not going to be as good. And it only does get a descaling in Arcane. So if you actually really wanted to go all into Bloodlust build up, you're not going to really benefit much. But the fact that it does get an arcane scaling means that you actually can improve it at least, which is definitely a benefit. But it definitely still does perform well enough to actually get an S tier. Number 9, the Bloody Hellas. Now this is a heavy thrusting sword, which they probably get like the best two-handed moveset in the entire game. Very quick poking attacks, which piercing damage is amazing. And those heavy running attacks are just absolutely ridiculous. They just cover so much distance incredibly quick. And this thing actually does get a B scaling in Arcane, to which you can actually just go all into that stat and end up getting a bunch of blood loss build up into some nice total overall damage, to which you're only really doing physical damage, but that's perfectly fine. You're not doing any split damage at all. But definitely the best thing about the weapon is going to be its weapon skill, Dynast's Finesse, which actually does get an inherent dodge, which is obviously going to be amazing for your neutral game because this dodge is just arguably better than like the dodge roll that you get, and it does only consume 5 FP, and you do get an additional follow-up attack, which is a very nice lunging poke, does a decent amount of damage, does some decent poise damage as well, and you can do a follow-up attack on top of that to do a nice horizontal swipe, to which against some smaller types of enemies that can get staggered easily, it is like a guaranteed combo. So yeah, this weapon just basically gets everything. Really good moveset, nice range, great scalings, not too high of a requirement, you get some nice blood loss build up, and an amazing Ash of War that's incredibly cheap. Really good. Number 8, we have the Great Stars. Now this is a great hammer, of which is probably just going to be one of the best strength weapons in the entire game, because not only do you get some of the best base damage, but you also get amazing poise damage, because great hammers does get the best poise damage in the entire game. And obviously alongside the blood loss build up that it does get, you actually get some healing on every single hit, which paired alongside certain types of weapon skills that can hit very quickly, you can end up making some just ridiculous like blood loss, health regen, lifesteal type of builds. So yeah, I was just talking about the Bloody Hellas having everything. This thing basically has everything. Number 7, we have the Scavenger's Curve Sword. Now this, obviously, being a curve sword, have a quick moveset, get some okay Ash of War options, and with this thing in particular, you can infuse it and get a whole bunch of blood loss build up. Now using it by itself is actually still pretty decent, especially paired with like Bloodblade. This is going to be like just a much better version of Reduvia, but obviously it peaks when you have it Power Stance, because Power Stance curve sword movesets is probably some of the best in the entire game, right up there with the Spears. Now this unfortunately does mean to go to New Game Plus, because you're going to get one per playthrough, but once you do acquire it, it's probably like the best New Game Plus build in the entire game. Is just absolutely ridiculous. There's having 2 of them and spamming like the jumping attacks and the running attacks just makes for such an incredibly easy experience. Number 6, we have the Cross Naginata. Now this is going to be a spear, of which actually does get a very unique light attack combo that has a mix of just poking attacks, horizontal swipes, and vertical swipes. But this weapon just gets like amazing range, it gets really good damage, and spears themselves already have decent movesets, so you can just pair it alongside another spear and do the Power Stance moveset, which is just one of the best in the entire game, just alongside the curved swords. Now, just like the Scavenger's Curve Sword, of which I just talked about, the Cross Naginata, you can only get one per playthrough. So if you did want to Power Stance them, you have to go into New Game Plus, but as I mentioned earlier, you can actually go pick up the Spiked Spear and just Power Stance those together, to which the Bleed Power Stance Spear build is probably not as going to be as good as the bleed power stance curve sword build, but the reason why the cross Naginata is still going to get a little bit higher than the scavenger's curve sword is that when you use it one-handed or two-handed, it's going to perform better than the curve sword, and spears also just get more Ash of War options, so for those reasons, I just put the cross Naginata above the scavengers. Number 5, the Moonveil Katana. Now yes, nobody really uses it just for its bleed benefits, but it does get bleed, so it's just going to make it to the list. But yeah, the Moonveil Katana is just amazing. It's a katana, so it's going to have an amazing moveset. You get that split magic damage, the really good intelligence and dexterity scaling, so your total overall damage can just be amazing as well. But yeah, that weapon skill is just absolutely ridiculous. Transient Moonlight is basically just Unsheath, but you just get a projectile. Like, Unsheath is already insane, but just having it turn into a projectile without even changing its speed at all. Now, yes, it does consume more FP, but it definitely is worth it because the projectile just makes it go like 3 times as far. So the fact that it's so like incredibly easy to use, it's definitely going to be one of the better weapons in the game. Now, some of the other weapons that you might see on this list might end up doing like more DPS or more damage in one hit, because the Moonveil Katana, although it can do some nice damage, it doesn't really have that same like one-shotting potential that some of the other weapons do get, but it still is a very solid overall weapon. Number 4, we have the Nagakiba. Now this is probably just the best katana in the entire game. I don't care what anybody says. The fact that it has this ridiculous range and then you can infuse it with just like a whatever the fuck that you want, really, whether it be Unsheath, Double Slash, Stormcaller, Impaling Thrust. There's so many cool weapon skills you can use it with, and being that katanas are classified as like smaller types of weapons, you just get the faster version of those movesets. And the Nagakiba just has like ridiculous range, more so than like some of the other spears in the game. So yeah, just being able to just like proc bleed and just do a whole bunch of damage that quickly at that distance is just ridiculous. Number 3, we have the Starfist. Now this is a fist-based weapon of which does like an absolute metric fuck ton of damage and just a bunch of stagger damage as well. The fact that you can do 33 stance damage and a charged heavy attack that comes out that fast is just absolutely ridiculous. Now you can actually build around this multiple different ways. You can go all into Arcane into a bleed build. You can just go all into strength with a poise breaking build, and both will just like trivialize the entire game. It can actually like outperform everything that you might see on this list. But the reason why it's not going to get number 1 is because it's not the most user or beginner friendly weapon. The range is just not that good at all. There are plenty of times where like you're pressed up against an enemy and then there'll be times you just miss, you just whiff so many times with this thing. It's like always like that with fist-based weapons in all the Souls games. They've gotten better over time, but it's still not the greatest in Elden Ring. But the fact that you can do that much damage, that much stagger damage, proc bleed, it's just ridiculous. Number 2, we have the Bloodhound's Fang. Now this weapon just gets like literally everything, like everything. It's a curved greatsword, so it's going to have an amazing moveset. Those heavy attacks come out really fast, honestly almost just as fast as like the light attack combo. You get extremely good damage with the jumping attacks because the motion values are just really high in that area. Now this weapon only does get a strength and dexterity based scaling, and you cannot infuse it, so normally there'll be no way to actually improve that bloodlust build up. However, you actually can buff it. So you can just pair it alongside Blade Grease or like Blood Flame Blade and just add even more bloodlust to this weapon, of which now you have just amazing damage, really good range, and really good bloodlust build up. But on top of that, you actually get a really good weapon skill in Bloodhound's Finesse. For 8 FP, you do this little backflipping attack that does some okay damage and puts you out of danger. And you can do an additional follow-up attack for 12 FP, to which does this like dashing attack that actually has a bunch of iframes. And that follow-up attack just does a whole bunch of damage and some really good stance damage. The entire combo can do 44 stance damage, 22 on each part, and it only consumes 20 FP, and it does it that quickly. And you also get an inherent iframe dodge. Like, what? But at number 1, sure to nobody's surprise, the Mohgwyn Sacred Spear. This thing is a fucking joke. It is just ridiculous as to how strong it actually is. It's a great spear, so you have some decent movesets. You can actually pair it alongside a shield and actually do some nice poking attacks while blocking as well if you wanted to do that. But you get a decent strength and arcane-based scaling. You can just go all into arcane because the scale's a lot better off that. You can do a bunch of bloodlust build up, and its weapon skill also scales off that, to which you just do a whole bunch of damage in a nice little AoE that staggers enemies really quickly, does a absolute fuck ton of bloodlust build up, to where against certain types of enemies they're just not standing a single chance. And even against enemies that cannot be bled out, it actually still does decent damage. Just having projectiles in general in this game just makes everything so incredibly easy. But the fact that the projectile does this is just insane. Like, what the fuck, man? Anyway, that's that. It's done. 44 weapons now completed. That's like the longest ranking video I've had. That's kind of cool. Anyway, please definitely like and subscribe for that one. That took a lot of effort. Please do it. I'm kidding, you don't have to. But definitely do follow me on Twitch though, because I am live there every single day doing some no-hit runs or just random challenge runs. Whatever I feel like, I do those things. So yeah, check me out there. Also, Raid Shadow Legends, best game ever made. Link in the description. Download it. QR code as well. Definitely do that. But see you guys next one. Bye.